Story 1. We'll see about that. I used to relish the solitude of the woods, the kind of isolation you can't find anywhere else. Back in the late 80s, before the ease of online bookings, I'd found this cabin through a friend of a friend, a place I could rent for a few days for my hunting trips. Those woods were like a second home to me, a place where I could listen to the birds, watch the morning fog lift off the forest floor, and wait for the chance at a good, clean shot. But that sense of peace was wiped away one autumn, and I still remember that encounter like it was yesterday. It was a morning like any other when it all started, cool and clear with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. I had set out early, eager for the hunt. The forest seemed to welcome me, but the peace didn't last long. As I was propped up against a tree a few hundred yards out from the cabin, a man appeared and took note of me. I pulled my hat off and slowly waved it back and forth to signal my position. Oddly, the man began to approach me. He was rugged, his beard long and gray. As he approached, he walked with an air of ownership over the trees around us. As he got within range of me, I called out a friendly, "Hello," but the man stopped and just looked at me, a look of anger and annoyance on his face. Skipping the formalities, he got straight to his point. "You staying in that cabin up the hill?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Figures," he retorted back. According to him, my rented cabin, and those like me who came from it, had been ruining his hunts for years. "I've been hunting on this land for decades, and ever since that jackass built that cabin out there, random people like you have been coming out here and ruining my hunts." The encounter took me by surprise, but I'm not one to be easily intimidated. I tried to keep the tension from my voice as I explained my position. I had every right to be there, just as he did. But rights seemed a flimsy thing between us, out there in the wilderness. "So that's how it's going to be," he said as he slightly nodded his head up and down, a gesture that to me felt more like a threat than an agreement. "Okay, we'll see about that," he said, before he melded back into the forest, leaving me on edge. The rest of the day was a bust. His words got under my skin, which is probably what he intended. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was in a sour mood and just wanted to sleep it off and try again the next day. My second day in the woods was no better. The deer seemed to have gotten a memo to steer clear of the area. I walked for hours, seeing nothing, the frustration growing with each empty clearing I stumbled upon. By late afternoon, I was ready to pack it in, my mood as dark as the sky was bright. As I made my way back, I saw smoke in the distance. At first, I thought it might just be smoke from a campfire, but the column was too large to just be a simple campfire. I began to realize as well that it was coming from the direction of the cabin. My heart raced as I made my way back, dread growing with every step. As I topped over the hill, my worst fears were confirmed. It was the cabin, ablaze, the smoke billowing out in a thick, choking wave. This was during a time before cell phones, so the only thing that I could do was jump in my truck and head into town to call for help. By the time the authorities, myself and the owner arrived back at the cabin, it was a total loss. The fire was out, but the cabin was gone, the inside gutted by flames. The authorities listened to my story about the other hunter, exchanging looks that said they knew exactly who I was talking about. They left, promising to talk to him. A day or two later, the feedback was as unsatisfying as it was frustrating. The other hunter had claimed to know nothing about it, and the authorities, based on the fire's origin inside the cabin, suggested I had been careless. It was a bitter pill to swallow, being blamed for something I knew wasn't my fault. The owner, faced with the charred remains of what used to be a source of income, decided to tear down what was left. I was convinced that the hunter I'd met was responsible. It seemed like a twisted way to reclaim his territory, by destroying what he saw as an invasion. But with no proof, and only my gut feeling to go on, I was left with nothing but the story of the encounter with the angry hunter. The owner, for his part, believed my story about the man, and never requested any compensation. My gut told me that he had had problems with this individual for quite some time, and the destruction of the cabin wasn't the last of the encounters between those two. Story 2. Headstones. I've never been one to scare easy. You can't be if you've spent half your life trekking through the woods, tracking game. But what I experienced one year, I don't know that I'll ever be able to wrap my head around. To be honest, I don't know that I want to. I was 37 at the time and had just found a new hunting ground. It was deep in the woods of West Virginia. It was untamed, wild, and untapped, or so I thought. I remember the leaves crunched under my boots, and the promise of a good day's hunt filled me with a familiar thrill. But that thrill turned cold when I stumbled upon an unexpected sight in the absolute middle of nowhere. A pair of headstones. They looked to be ancient, dating back to the late 1800s, old and moss-covered, their inscriptions worn away by time and weather. I stood there for a minute just looking at them. As I did, a creepy, unsettling feeling ran over me. It ran straight down my spine and all the way down to the tips of my toes. The woods seemed to fall silent and become heavy, and I felt like I was being watched. It was a feeling I'd never felt in the woods before. Not wanting to stick around any longer, I quickly turned and continued into the woods with my rifle. I walked for probably about 15 minutes before finding a fallen tree to take a quick break on. As I walked, though, the creepiness that I had experienced at the headstones never left me. I felt like I was being followed, although at the time I never heard or saw anything out of the ordinary. The creepiness reached another level when, during that rest, I swear I began to hear voices. I looked around but saw nothing. Assuring myself that the woods were just playing tricks on me, I grabbed my gun and carried on. I had been in the woods many times before, but this trip definitely felt different. I pressed on, deeper into the woods, putting distance between me and those headstones. But the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the sense that something was following me. Footsteps seemed to echo my own at times, stopping when I stopped, walking when I walked. I scanned the woods around me but never saw anything, at least not right then. I chalked it up to nerves, the headstones playing tricks on my mind. Finally, finding a large, sturdy tree, I settled against it, taking up a watchful position. The forest had come alive again with the sounds of nature, and the eerie feeling began to ebb away. I focused on the hunt, on the rustling of deer through the underbrush, on the distant call of birds. But then, a new sound cut through the calm, a voice, clear and distinct, calling for help. I was on my feet in an instant, rifle forgotten as I scanned the woods for the source. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer, just the continuous plea for help, repeating over and over like a broken record. The call was faint, but in the middle of the woods, out in the middle of nowhere, it pierced straight into my ears like knives. I moved toward the sound, my heart pounding, wondering who could be out here, wondering if it was a trap. "Help," the voice would say. "Help me." My confusion was quickly turning to terror, as I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every nerve in my body began to shake. "Hello?" I called out again. "Who's out there?" But there was no response. Then, for a minute, it became eerily quiet. Everything stopped, and it's like time stood still. And that's when I saw her. A woman, ghostly pale with hair so white it seemed to almost glow. I stood there, locked onto her, trying to process what I was looking at. She was otherworldly, ethereal, and gave me the coldest fear I've ever felt in my life. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but her mouth was open in a silent scream that matched the desperate calls for help echoing around me. I don't remember grabbing my gun or deciding to run, but before I could even realize it, I was sprinting out of the woods with a speed that I didn't know that I had. Branches whipped my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare to look back either. Fear propelled me forward until I reached my truck. There, I gasped for air. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping me from passing out. My lungs were on fire, and I could feel my heart pounding like a jackhammer. I jumped into my truck, peeled out of those woods, and never returned. Honestly, for the most part, I gave up hunting. It's a shame, I used to love it. But every time I stepped foot into any woods, I was taken back to that moment where I saw something that I'll never be able to explain. The encounter opened my eyes to things in this world that society tells us doesn't exist. The hunter became the hunted that day, in my opinion, and that's something that I just can't deal with. Story 3. Broken Antler. I remember this one hunt like it was yesterday. It was cold that day, but the chill didn't bother me. I was warmed by the thrill of the hunt and the heavy gear I carried. I'd been stalking through the dense underbrush since first light. The forest was alive with the usual suspects: chattering squirrels, a distant woodpecker going about his morning routine, the occasional flutter of wings as birds went about their business. But something else was there too, an unsettling feeling that had the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I kept feeling like someone, or something, was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I would hear rustling and see flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye that would disappear just as quickly as it would appear. It was unsettling, but not enough to keep me from my hunt. I reasoned that it was probably just a curious bear. I stayed on alert, but pressed on. After some time, I finally arrived at my spot and settled in. At first it was quiet, but then, through a break in the trees, I saw it, a beautiful buck. It was a magnificent creature, muscular and poised, its antlers a complex tangle of sharp points. I raised my rifle, adrenaline pumping through my veins, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing off the trees, and the buck leapt before bolting. I knew I'd hit it with a perfect shot. I waited for a moment, listening as it trailed off into the distance, then collapsing with a faint thud. As I walked over, I picked up the blood trail. It was clear and bright against the decaying leaves. I followed the trail with a hunter's focus, the excitement of the chase pushing me forward. The blood led me over a ridge. It was there that things took a turn for the bizarre. The trail ended in a pool of blood, but there was no deer. It looked like the deer had fallen, struggled some, and then nothing. It was as if it had been lifted straight into the air. Where in the hell did it go? I thought to myself. I was stumped and scoured the area, but it was as if the earth had swallowed the buck whole. I was so confused. I couldn't understand where it could have gone. With that amount of blood loss, it couldn't have jumped up and walked off. If it was dragged out by a bear or something, there would have been an obvious drag trail on the ground. Unease settled in my stomach as I hiked back to camp. The guys were gathered around the fire, and I recounted my story. They were just as confused as I was. We decided we'd all go out in the morning to look, figuring maybe the animal had somehow, some way, gotten up and moved on despite the injury. We were all experienced hunters, but this just didn't make any sense. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The comforting sounds of crickets and owls was there, but so was that unsettling feeling of being watched that I felt earlier in the day. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the after effects of an adrenaline-filled day. Then, out of the silence came a sound that chilled me to the bone. A strange, bark-like yell, followed by a thud against the canvas of my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and burst outside, expecting to find one of the guys messing around. Instead, I found half of the buck's rack lying there. It wasn't just broken. It looked like it had been torn from the animal's head with incredible force. My voice shook as I called out to the others, and one by one, they emerged from their tents, sleepy and confused. It was clear from their faces they weren't responsible. We sat up the rest of the night, too spooked to sleep, trying to figure out what was happening. At first light, we went back to the ridge. We searched methodically, covering every inch of ground, but it was as if the buck had vanished into thin air. The silence of the forest was unnerving. It felt like even the birds and squirrels were in fear of something. The sense of being watched had intensified, and we all felt it. Whatever this feeling was, it was thick and overwhelming. This feeling, along with the events that had taken place over the past day, was enough to make us want to pack up camp early. We headed out later that day, carrying with us more questions than answers. The mystery of the vanishing deer and the eerie presence that shadowed us during our hunting trip will forever remain unsolved, I guess.